So I'm Deborah Richardson, Executive Director of the International Human Trafficking Institute. Welcome to our fourth conversation in our series of Way Forward, the intersection of labor and sex exploitation with race, gender, and class. Before we begin, those of us in Atlanta know that this has been a very eventful 10 days for us. And I want to spend a few moments in recognizing two heroes who certainly made the lives of many of us different. So I want to take a few minutes to recognize the legacy of two American heroes who changed the course of history, and that's Congressman John Lewis and Reverend Dr. C.T. Vivian. These two men, one C.T. from Illinois, John from Alabama, met up while they were in college in Nashville. They became lieutenants in the American Civil Rights Movement in both the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as well as the Student Nonviolence Coordinating Committee. Their work intersected on several levels, and afterwards they both made their homes here in Atlanta. We know that the work that they've done is very significant, and our prayer is that people will continue to share this legacy of their work from generation to generation. So may we please have a moment of silence in recognition of the incredible sacrifices of C.T. and John. Thank you very much. Today we shine a light on one condition that is disproportionately impacts all trafficked persons, and that is economic insecurity. People who live in impoverished communities are the most vulnerable to sexual exploitation, and there's a little explored about the conditions of low-wage jobs drive labor exploitation in our communities. We will hear from two activist researchers with Partners for Dignity and Rights who conducted research collecting data and stories from both experts in the field and those directly impacted by exploited labor in Metro Atlanta and throughout the state of Georgia. Throughout their presentation, please put your questions in the chat box and we will answer them at the end and have a robust conversation. But first, let me share more about the organization and introduce you to our presenters. Partners for Dignity and Rights is formerly known as the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative. For almost 30 years, they have worked in partnership with community organizations across this country. Their track record includes stopping the criminalization of Black and Brown youth in schools with restorative justice alternatives and creating groundbreaking programs governed by workers to enforce human rights in the workplace. So now I'll introduce our presenters. First, Kathy Albiza, the founding director. From its inception, Kathy's goal was to build legitimacy for human rights in general and economic and social rights specifically. She is committed to a community-centered and participatory human rights approach that is locally anchored but universal and global in its vision. Kathy has a background in constitutional and human rights and significant expertise in reproductive justice, corporate accountability, and economic and social rights. She received a BA from the University of Miami and is a graduate of Columbia Law School. Brittany Scott is Senior Research Strategist. Since 2010, Brittany has supported grassroots partners organizing for economic democracy and human rights at the intersections of housing, development, and labor. She has researched and documented human rights abuses in public and private housing and across low-wage sectors of the economy. Brittany received her BA from Washington University in St. Louis and a JD from Fordham Law School. Kathy and Brittany, thank you so much for being with us this morning. We really appreciate you and what you're about to share with us. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for having us and organizing this conversation. I should start with a little bit of how we ended up doing this research in Atlanta, so people know this story. As you've already sort of indicated, Partners works with community organizations and worker centers across the country supporting long-term campaigns that create structural change towards racial, economic, and gender justice. So that is generally who we are. Many years ago, in our right around our founding in 2004, we became indirectly involved actually with the labor trafficking universe through our support of the Fair Food Campaign, spearheaded by farm workers in Immokalee, Florida, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. Now, while the coalition struggled to change labor conditions for farm workers, they had a related battle against forced trafficking and slavery in the state. So for those who don't know, from the 1990s to about 2010, they helped unearth about 9 major slavery and forced labor cases that over time liberated upward of 1,500 people. This included some big cases back in the 90s with armed camps, guns, death threats, where they held up to 700 workers at a time. And these cases did not simply pop up in the 90s, right? The change that created these prosecutions was that suddenly there was a worker group who intimately knew the industry and started investigating them. They would literally put their lives on the line to get them prosecuted. CIW members would enter the forced labor camps and slave camps to find out what was happening, and then they had to be rescued by the organization to serve as witnesses, because otherwise workers were too afraid to serve as witnesses in these cases because their families were threatened, mostly back in Guatemala, Mexico, or Haiti. Now, that's our sort of touch point, how we started getting connected and understanding that deep relationship between the labor landscape and forced labor and slavery. Humanity United, a DC-based foundation, for a couple of years supported CIW's work, anti-trafficking work. And then when they became interested in Atlanta, they approached us to do this research because they knew of our history on the issue. And we said, sure. And once we did the research, we discovered that there was actually a lot of synergy between what we're doing with our partners in other cities and the issues that emerged here. And you'll be hearing about that from Brittany later, but with that background, let me just give a sort of big picture introduction to how we see that relationship between labor and forced labor and labor conditions and forced labor and slavery. Okay, so can we start the slides, Britt? Are we on them? Can we go to the next one? Okay, just keep that number in mind and try to guess what it might be, what it might stand for. It's virtually impossible to really know how deep or broad our forced labor and slavery crisis is. In fact, once I started having some exposure to the issue, I got a little bit paranoid, and every time I was somewhere, I would wonder if it was right in front of me, hidden in plain sight, as they say. And as I mentioned, what was happening in Florida was probably happening for a long time, and no one knew it. Looking at what we know, just looking at a study from 2013 to 2016, that found slavery cases in 20 states. So that's what that number stands for, that there were at least 20 states where those cases were unearthed. But if I had to guess, I believe we would find forced labor and slavery in almost all 50 states. And it's probably far more cases than the ones that they identified. Yet only 2% of prosecutions for human trafficking are forced labor cases. Why is that? Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, they're the tip of the iceberg. Sorry, should have gone to that slide first. But it's, yes, those cases that we found are definitely the tip of the iceberg. There are a lot more cases underneath that no one ever sees. So let's move on to the next slide. And then we get to why is that? If you look at this quote, it's pretty astonishing. By and large, labor trafficking investigations were not prioritized by local or federal law enforcement. Survivors mostly escaped on their own and lived for several months or years before being connected to a specialized service provider. Local and federal law agencies, and this is the part I want people to wrap their brains around, had difficulty defining labor trafficking and separating it from other forms of labor exploitation and workplace abuses. So it is incredibly telling that our labor landscape is so degraded that the feds and other law enforcement cannot tell the difference sometimes between just regular American abusive workers and forced labor. Let's move to the next slide. When Senator Sanders visited Immokalee in 2008, he noted this reality and stated that the norm is a disaster and the extreme is slavery. The important point here is that it's all part of a continuum. So let's go to the next one. So I tried to make this slide pretty, I failed. So I just made a list here. And what's on top of the line is the part of the continuum that we can intervene for prevention. And what's below the line is the part of the continuum where we have to intervene once we have failed to prevent, right? So let's go to the next slide now. So prevention, there's not just one system to intervene in order to try to create prevention. But we believe that we need to pay far more attention to prevention, regardless of which system you're intervening in. Why? It's simple. We cannot prosecute our way out of this problem. Prosecution is necessary, but it is a false solution if you want to eradicate this heinous level of abuse. What we learned working in Immokalee was that prosecution was simply a tactic to bring attention to the real problem. And so long as labor conditions remain degraded, we would see forced labor, we would see slavery. Now, yes, migration and global economy issues also create tremendous vulnerabilities, but from where we sat as, frankly, a small to mid-sized movement support organization, neither we nor our partners could figure out a way to intervene in the migration or global economy structures. Most days that just felt a little bit above our pay grade. We felt we could, though, intervene and interrupt some of the degraded labor conditions in the sector in which our partners were organizing. Normally, we supported local work with the idea that enough localities created change, it would become a national trend. Industry and sectoral change was a slightly bigger goal than our typical locally based work, but it felt achievable. And we did, at least in the area of farm work, intervene and interrupt the conditions that gave rise to forced labor and farm work. But before I continue, and I'm going to continue with that story after you hear a little bit about Atlanta, before I continue with it, I want to turn it over to Brittany to introduce herself and share what we learned talking to many of you about Atlanta. Because it is, whether it's farm work, whether it's construction, whether it's poultry, whether it's a temp work, a range of sort of degraded low-wage labor environments, the similarities are astounding. So let me hand it over to you, Britt, and then you'll hand it back over to me.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Deborah and Randy, and to everybody else who joined to be a part of this conversation today. It's great to see so many folks joining. So I get to share some of the research findings of the research that we did for Humanity United last year on labor exploitation in Atlanta. So this research was based, as Deborah said at the beginning, primarily on interviews with representatives of mostly community-based organizations in the Atlanta area, but also some academics and advocates with different kinds of connections to the local community. And we did supplement it with some light additional desk research. So I just wanted to start by creating the backdrop for the labor market in the metro area, and beginning with what we all see. Atlanta is a thriving metro area. At the same time, there's persistent poverty in the city, and that's remained very stable actually in terms of just being a persistent reality in the city. At the same time, there's a growing number of poor people in the suburbs. So, in fact, you have the both of those realities coexist to create the greatest income disparity in the U.S. For the metro area. Challenges that interviewees identified within this landscape include, gentrification in the city, and disconnection with transportation and resources in the suburbs in particular, but really like transportation connecting folks to jobs, whether in the city or the suburbs, was something brought up by a number of people. It's worth noting that poor in the city generally means being Black, while recent immigrants are largely living in the suburbs. So there is this segregation, and segregation does, entrench inequities. And in addition to that, moving on to kind of this other piece of the backdrop, nearly all interviewees mentioned either or both the anti-Black and anti-immigrant policies that reinforce barriers to improving conditions. There are roughly 1 million immigrants in Georgia, which I found striking because that's more than Arizona and New Mexico combined. A little bit less than half of those immigrants are undocumented, and about 60% of that undocumented population in Georgia live in just 5 metro Atlanta counties. And the criminalization of this community is extreme. It's really at a level that surpasses anything I've seen elsewhere in the country. Certainly, criminalization of the community exists across the country, but in the metro Atlanta area, it's striking. Because Metro Atlanta has one of the highest rates of arrest of immigrants with no criminal record and deportations in the country. We were talking about the transportation issues earlier. Driving without a license is a jailable offense, but Georgia doesn't offer undocumented immigrants any way to obtain a license. So simply driving to work creates a risk of arrest. And because counties in Atlanta are among some of the most cooperative with ICE, that risk of driving to work and being arrested also creates a risk of deportation. Refugees also find little relief in asylum. If you're in New York City, 40% of those applications are granted. But if you're in Atlanta, only 3% are granted. So there's obviously that criminalization feeds into the conditions in the labor market, which I'll return to as we move forward. But just in terms of the backdrop, I want to continue with this threat of criminalization, because Metro Atlanta not only has this incredible system of criminalization of recent immigrants, but it also has the largest concentration of adults that are stuck in a for-profit probation system. A rough quarter of the state's population has a criminal record, and likewise, these two systems keep a largely Black and brown population out of the mainstream job market, which tends to have the effect of forcing them to accept bad jobs and often abusive jobs. So we'll return to some of that in a bit. But I still want to go through this backdrop of to kind of place us for the conversation about the working conditions, because it all does relate. So another piece of this puzzle is the state, right, and the state's hostility to workers' interests. I'm sure some of you are in the Atlanta area and may be aware that the state minimum wage is actually lower than the federal minimum wage. The federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, whereas Georgia's state minimum wage is actually $5.15, which means that workers who are making minimum wage are mostly making the federal minimum wage, but it is one of those signs of the state of affairs. In addition, if we're going to be laying the backdrop for labor conditions, it's worth noting that, the state of Georgia has the second lowest unionization rate in the U.S. And it's, definitely a big piece of that is that in Georgia has actually had a right to work law since the 1940s. And right to work laws, essentially, what they do is they make it very difficult for unions to be sustainable by really attacking their system of funding. So, on top of all of this, the public system, for enforcing workers' rights, I'd like to say that it's better at deterring workers' complaints than securing legal remedies, let alone preventing abuse. There's just simply a ton of obstacles in the way, and we did hear that from some of the folks who we interviewed and had tried helping workers navigate the system, that they were running into incredible barriers to having any success in that process. And add on top of that the state consistently prevents and invalidates local laws, local efforts to pass laws locally that would improve workers' pay and conditions. So, different localities at various times, specifically like in Atlanta, have tried to, raise the minimum wage, put in place a prevailing wage, pass a paid leave policy or fair scheduling law, and the state each time has either, you know, invalidated those through action after, or has taken action before that has even happened to prevent localities from being able to exercise that kind of, you know, democratic authority of their local conditions. And another piece of the puzzle that is noted here on this slide is that folks did raise, you know, not just segregation in communities, and but also the racial division and segregation in the workplaces. So I did want to include that here. So next slide. Folks we talked to identified certain industries where they felt abuses were particularly concentrated. And before I actually get to poultry processing, I did want to say that, you know, folks we talked to, you know, did mention farm work, but we were trying to focus in on Metro Atlanta, and farm work was largely outside of the metro area, and also domestic work, specifically, you know, that you know, obviously the conditions in both industries are atrocious. But in domestic work in particular, the bright side was that the National Domestic Workers Alliance has started a local chapter and is in Atlanta, and was focused on Black workers in particular, and a rich history of organizing in the community. So both of those industries were unsurprisingly mentioned, but I think most widely mentioned were actually two other industries. And probably the number one most mentioned was poultry processing. It was consistently reported as one of the worst employers in the area. You know, Georgia is the industry's capital. It really, in the you know, it's a notorious industry in the South, period. And the conditions in Georgia are not unique, but they are striking, and it's a major employer in the area. So conditions mentioned included low wages and harsh conditions. One woman we spoke with who had worked in the industry, she was formerly incarcerated herself, and she mentioned you work 90 hours to make $600 to $700 a week. So you combine that low minimum wage and this is where you end up, 90 hours a week for $600 to $700. You know, the workspace is cold. They work in about 40-degree temperatures, and they're doing the same motions over and over, so repetitive motions. And you know, at the end of the day, that, in addition to an industry that, you know, is cited consistently with having safety violations, and, you know, despite those citations, continues to push line speeds beyond the ability of folks to, in a cold environment, doing repetitive motion, to, you know, that we're seeing that the industry has some of the highest rates of injuries, and that is the kind of stuff that we were hearing from people we were speaking to in Atlanta. You know, I mean, I think it's not surprising that the workforce has a high turnover. One interviewee estimated 100% turnover over the course of a year. You know, year to year, it's not the same people in the plant. The industry notoriously preys on vulnerable groups to fill labor needs. So certainly undocumented immigrants, but also, I mean, I was personally surprised to hear about recent refugees being placed in the plants by resettlement agencies, incarcerated people, in addition to formerly incarcerated people being placed in the plants. So I do want to focus on that last piece, just to note that folks with criminal records are, of course, largely kept, not of course, but in reality, largely kept out of mainstream employment after release from prison. So, you know, there aren't like a ton of options. And the poultry processing plants are one of the few employers that will hire them. And related to the kind of this, you know, the system that we talked about earlier, these swelling numbers of people that are caught up in the criminal justice system since the 80s, there are a number of incarcerated people who are still technically, you know, within the prison system in Georgia, are being diverted into work centers, which are a part of the prison system. But that these work centers, it's basically the way for the Department of Corrections leases workers or prisoners to do work for private employers in the area. And there is definitely one of the major private employers in the area that's receiving prison labor through the system is the poultry plant. And I mean, so whereas like workers who are undocumented can be arrested by ICE and deported, workers in a work release program can be sent back to prison. You know, they can't find jobs elsewhere, and they are a completely captive workforce. So the other industry, I just wanted, we can flip to the next slide. The other industry that was most often mentioned by interviewees for its abuses was the construction industry. It's a booming industry in Atlanta, but it is heavily subcontracted. At the bottom of these labor contracting chains, there's a lot of vulnerable workers. And these vulnerable workers are a lot of undocumented immigrants. And interestingly, a couple interviewees noted that there's actually a lot of people experiencing homelessness who are working at the bottom of these subcontracting chains in the construction industry in the Atlanta area. It is a largely cash economy at the bottom, which does leave a lot of room for exploitation. And wage theft is extremely common, which means, you know, people aren't being paid for the work that they're doing. And those at the bottom are also the ones that are doing the most dangerous jobs on the site. So the most vulnerable workers on the site are doing the most dangerous work. And too often they're doing it without adequate protective equipment, training, and the things they need to do to be safe. So again, high rates of injuries and, you know, noted here, but probably also true in the poultry plants, few injured workers are getting workers' comp. One last note about these two industries before I shift gears a bit. Temp staffing was also mentioned as one of the ways that both industries meet their labor needs. And there was a bit of a difference in terms of, it sounded like, at least in the construction industry, I heard a little bit more about it. I did hear a little bit about it in terms of like a relationship between you know, refugees accessing employment in the poultry plants through the temp agencies, but in the construction, it was primarily Black workers who were accessing construction work through the temp staffing, whereas undocumented immigrants had more informal connections in ways that they were being connecting with the construction industry and the jobs. So I do want to flip to the next slide. And just shift a little bit to introduce a bit about what our work looks like outside of Atlanta before I actually kick it back to Kathy to dig a bit deeper into some of the specific solutions that we've been working on over the years with our partners, and to relate it back to this. So to begin with, you know, just based on our work in other cities, which has been, you know, in Chicago and Minneapolis and Tennessee, even places like, you know, New York and California, generally speaking, the conditions in Atlanta aren't unique. There are definitely like some aspects of Atlanta that seem more egregious than anything I've seen, but there's a lot of similarities actually that we see in the conditions in other cities and that we also see in Atlanta. So to start with, you know, last year, a forced labor case was surfaced in the Twin Cities construction industry. The industry's reliance, you know, across the nation on Latin American immigrants for low-paid, dangerous work is widespread. Wage theft is pervasive, and you know, because of the risks of speaking up, deportation, loss of work for folks who are living paycheck to paycheck, day to day, folks aren't reporting most violations. And, you know, given the degraded conditions in construction generally, perhaps it's unsurprising that the industry is also a consistent site for trafficked workers. It's actually one of the first industries that we're seeing, you know, some of those cases being addressed in court. And one of those places was this last year in the Twin Cities. Because low-wage immigrant workers, like Kathy said earlier, in this industry are organized in the Twin Cities, we are starting to see cases there being prosecuted. So in last year, for the first time ever in the region, thanks to the intel of SATOOL, the local worker center, and one of our partners, criminal charges were actually brought against a contractor for taking advantage of his employees' immigration status to force them to work for him. So in one case, just as an example, he bailed a worker out of immigration custody and then told the worker he had to work off the debt. And, you know, other workers also said that the contractor frequently threatened them, you know, with calling ICE if about issues like wage theft or concerns about conditions or and other issues. You know, he frequently brought them in from other places and offered them housing that he didn't end up paying for, that was in poor condition. So ultimately, the contractor pled guilty to the labor trafficking charges. So also, you know, in the poultry industry, it's another industry that is rife with abuse throughout the South. It's not limited to Georgia, but it is throughout the South, and Georgia happens to be the capital of that industry. Advocates have documented low stagnant wages and brutal conditions for years now. I thought it was, you know, line speeds in particular, and the pressure from the industry to increase those line speeds despite the like incredible rates of injuries and debilitating injuries that are reported from the industry. You know, so in 2000, the USDOL actually did a survey of 51 plants throughout the country, and roughly a fourth of those plants, I guess 51 plants is roughly a fourth of those plants, but 100% of those 51 plants were found to be committing wage theft. 100% of a quarter of all the plants, and those were just the ones that were surveyed. So 100% of surveyed poultry plants were committing wage theft. So, you know, just to shift beyond those two industries, there is another sector where we've spent a lot of time at Partners for Dignity and Rights documenting very similar conditions, is in the factories and warehouses in Chicago and in several other cities in the country that fulfill their labor needs through temp staffing. So these are, you know, factories in Chicago that use temp staffing to meet their labor needs. A couple of years ago, we did a survey with temps in 4 cities who were working in factories and warehouses in their respective cities. And I just wanted to give you a flavor for how similar the conditions are. I'll briefly share just like a handful of findings. I think the most, perhaps one of the most striking ones, for just because we call it temp work, is the fact that temp work isn't temporary at all. The average temp in our study had been a temp for 6 years, and they'd been in a particular job for an average of 3 years. So these are folks that are, this is a structural feature of this particular sector in which they were working. No one was being offered direct employment at the factory or warehouse they were working. You know, the average annual income was under $14,000. 3/4 had experienced wage theft. So on top of being paid poverty wages, you're not even receiving all of those wages that are due to you. You know, a fourth reported that they'd been injured on the job, and more than 3/4, 84%, had experienced some kind of like safety related violation. You know, and for workers who flagged any concerns about the situation, retaliation was basically a certainty. And, you know, I think it's just worth also noting that most of the temps were, again, Latin American immigrants and Black Americans, and that folks from both groups felt discriminated against or targeted due to their race or ethnicity. And, you know, related to that, this is an issue we've been digging a little bit more deeply into with our partners. But I can cite some of the there's been recent lawsuits and investigative journalism that's already out there that's coming out of Chicago primarily, but also I think there are some cases in other parts of the country. Chicago, again, these things are coming to light because there are organized workers that are, you know, familiar with the industry, that are bringing light to what's happening. But what happened in these lawsuits, and that the journalists investigated deeper, is that is that the factory and warehouse owners are actually using temp staffing agencies to segregate their workplaces. So to be more specific, whistleblowers who were Latino dispatchers for the temp agencies reported having to use racially coded language to place the race-based labor orders of these factories and warehouses. So they would use fairly offensive language, but that like blue eyes for a white person, but much more offensive words for Black and brown workers to specifically request workers by their race. The anti-Black bias of those labor orders created both the segregation that workers and organizers see, and that that we see kind of on a larger scale, and also we could see was feeding division that makes organizing even more difficult. So our partners are trying to grapple with some of these issues in a few different ways. If I could do a broad stroke and then pass it on to Kathy. In the temp industry, definitely trying to tackle the racial division and segregation, using tools like match pairs testing to document that reality. Workers and organizers know it's true, but it's actually like a hard problem to prove and prove for the purposes of supporting a range of strategies: organizing, litigation, prevention-focused policy advocacy. But more broadly, with our partners in the worker center movement, we're focused on creating models that secure a floor of basic enforceable standards that both shift the power dynamics immediately, while also creating a foundation on which to organize for higher standards, and an even more powerful voice for workers in their workplaces. So, where there are opportunities to improve conditions and leverage resources through local government, our partners are pursuing, ideas like co-enforcement relationships through which public resources are channeled to the workers' organizations to help them, activate vulnerable workers as monitors of their own rights through education and supporting their role in reporting abuses and successfully navigating this overly complicated obstacle course of a public complaint system. But where the state is more hostile, like in Georgia, supply chain agreements are a primary focus of ours and our partners. And this is the point where I'm going to pitch it back to Kathy to dig a bit more deep into that particular piece of our work.
Okay, and I'll try to be brief because I know that we want time for Q&A. So as Brittany noted, the problems are multifaceted, but given that our focus here is the risks of human trafficking, just keep in mind these sectors have all the high risk indicators, right? Cash economy, day work, abusive, exploitive work environment. When you talk about 100% turnover right there, it's hard to keep workers, and therefore sometimes workers are likely to be forced being kept. The last one being, I forgot, I had 5 in my mind. And the fact that prison labor is being used means forced labor is actually formally being used already to support some of these industries. And just as the issues are multifaceted, there are definitely different ways to grapple and step into it. But what we're going to share briefly in our last few minutes is where our work has gone deep, working with partners on what we call the worker-driven social responsibility model. Brief background: the worker-driven social responsibility model, which is now being promoted by the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network, which is a transnational network, emerged out of 2 different efforts in the global garment industry in Bangladesh with all the factories that were collapsing in the deaths, and efforts in Immokalee, Florida. This unlikely pairing of efforts came together because they each found their way to what we call a supply chain strategy, where you target the corporations at the top of a supply chain to create different conditions at the bottom, because effectively it is these big buyers, these large corporations that control what actually happens down the chain. So we're going to show a very short 2-minute video, and then I'll wrap up in a minute, and then we can open it up and have a conversation. So if we could move to the video.
From food and clothing to electronics electronics, many of the goods we use every day come to us through supply chains. Atop the supply chains are name brands with instantly recognizable logos. In recent decades, these companies have experienced remarkable growth. Mega buyers now wield unprecedented market power to purchase goods and services as cheaply as possible, pressuring suppliers to cut prices or lose out to their competitors. This price pressure drives employers to cut wages and push workers even harder. Sweatshop conditions and dangerous workplaces are the norm. Forced labor and sexual violence take root as well. While much of this exploitation is invisible to consumers, disasters sometimes pierce the veil. To each of these tragedies, corporations respond with crisis management public relations, promise to do better. They point to their voluntary standards without enforcement. Unsurprisingly, nothing changes for workers. But what if there were another path? In recent years, workers have developed a new paradigm for protecting their rights in supply chains. Worker-driven social responsibility has been tested from the agricultural fields of the United States to the apparel factories of Bangladesh. In these harsh environments, WSR has proven its ability to change workers' lives. Here's how. WSR is driven by workers themselves and based in legal agreements with brands at the top of supply chains. This ensures workplace standards are binding and enforceable. Suppliers who violate their workers' rights immediately lose their buyer's business. These agreements also commit brands to pay prices that allow for and incentivize suppliers to comply. Finally, WSR requires independent monitoring, in which workers themselves play a frontline role. Real progress is seldom easy, but worker-driven social responsibility offers a blueprint at last to ensure dignified conditions for the 500 million people working in factories, farms, and other workplaces across the world who touch our lives every single day.
Thank you for letting us share that. Essentially, this model, this one solution that has found to be very effective, especially in places like Atlanta and Florida, where the state is so hostile to any local kind of efforts to get better enforcement of workers' rights, is premised on recognizing that the real power, the real economic power is at the way top of the supply chain. Even though these middlemen might be committing the abuses, at the end of the day, you could cycle them out, get rid of them, find new ones, and they will commit the same abuses because it is structural. It is set up to be that way. And the pressure is coming from the top. So the WSR model, as the video sort of briefly went over it, is based on this understanding. Workers at the bottom target and campaign against a corporation at the top for a legally binding agreement, not something voluntary, something that is legally binding. That is important because it's what shifts powers, what democratizes power back to workers. Economic responsibility is found to be at the top. So all these agreements require buyers to pay something into the system to increase wages, or like in Bangladesh, to fix the factories, because the middlemen, awful as they are, don't actually even have the money because all the profits are going to the top. Similarly, there's one program now in dairy in Vermont where Ben & Jerry's is paying for housing improvements because the farmers don't have the money, whether they're good intentioned or ill intentioned, they simply don't have it. Market consequences are what drives this particular solution. This legally binding agreement requires these buyers at the top to cut contracts if there is a consistent, persistent violation. It's a system of prevention. So the middlemen, wherever they are, whether they're farmers or factory owners, are given an opportunity to correct through corrective action plans. But if they do not in good faith, swiftly, within weeks, correct, they lose their business. So it's a new model for labor. Rather than disrupting production, it's disrupting sales. Finally, when we say it's worker driven, it's not just that the workers signed the agreement. is that the workers actually get to decide as part of that agreement who the monitor is, who comes in and decides when there's a violation, who processes complaints, who does the audits to make sure that the wage increases are actually getting into workers' hands and there isn't wage theft. This model, we don't have time to talk in great depth, but for those who are interested, please feel free to follow up with us or visit the WSRN website. Is definitely one approach. It takes years, it's a heavy lift, they're long campaigns, but the rewards have been great. And it is one way it is one of the reasons why I think we have not seen a forced labor case out of Immokalee since 2010. Okay, now we are ready for your questions, or at least as ready as we're gonna be.
I see a couple questions. Should I jump in on the first one from Deandra?
Sure.
I see a question of what's the known percentage of underage children working in the poultry industry in Georgia? And I mean, my short answer is that I don't know the answer to that specific question. But I did want to note that when we were doing the study with the temp workers, where we were talking to temp workers who were working in the factories and the warehouses in, I think it was Boston, Chicago, LA, and New Jersey. So kind of the harbors and hubs, 4 major harbors and hubs where goods are being moved. You know, it wasn't actually a question that was asked of the workers about, you know, child labor, but actually, so there was focus groups that were a part of the study, and in the focus groups in 2 different cities in the study, in totally separate, disconnected ways without any prompt, we're talking about child labor. So I did just want to mention that, like, you know, maybe we're not asking the question, but it is probably there, and we definitely, it definitely came up.
Yeah, so that's probably something that remains to be explored.
Yeah.
What's interesting and worth noting about what we've learned from our partners in Bangladesh is that a lot of the child labor that occurs in that industry doesn't occur in the factories themselves, occurs in even the more informal economy, because the women in the factories themselves are so underpaid that they have to send their children to work. So when you have these sort of really low wages, whether you see child labor in the industry or not, it fuels child labor, right? Because the families are desperate and they can't get by. Someone asked about the gender lens. There has been a lot learned about sort of the specific impacts on gender and women and gender, which are related but not the same. One of the areas, of course, is GBV, gender-based violence. It's not the only one, but it's one of them. And we have found that where you see forced labor, the next worst, or the closest, like the next big, really deep abuse is quid pro quo rape and sexual abuse. In all the programs that we're working with, there are now 4 around the world. One is in Lesotho, there's Bangladesh, there's Florida, and there's the dairy. One of the complaints that rise to the surface on a regular basis is sexual abuse and rape. In fact, the program in Lesotho, which is a denim factory, found that almost 100% of the women had been forced to engage into quid pro quo sex or rape or been raped in order to stay at the factories. Similarly, in farm work, almost 100% of the women, 2/3 in the studies, but anecdotally, I've yet to find somebody who hasn't been actually confronted with these situations, has to deal with sexual abuse or rape. The program in Immokalee has made that one of its signature issues. Temp work, we looked at focus groups and found that quid pro quo, sex abuse, sexual abuse, young women who are told that they, you know, can only keep their jobs or be promoted if they sleep with the supervisor is absolutely the norm. So GBV is deeply ensconced into these dynamics. And then there's also the addition that women are segregated into the lower wage jobs, right?
There's
so
women's work and men's work.
Right,
Yeah.
in the temp agencies, but as well as farm work and almost all these other sectors, women are funneled into a particular set of jobs. Often those are lower paid. And the other gender impacts are that the schedules, because women have this disproportionate role in the childcare, the schedules are so erratic and so impossible that they're often fired because they can't make a last minute trip into the factory or onto the farm because they have a sick child or because they have, a pickup at school, and they had planned around it, and suddenly the employer is like, no, we need you now, because there's no agency over your own scheduling. So scheduling is another issue that everyone is subject to, but it disproportionately affects caregivers, and those are disproportionately women. So I don't know if that gets at your question, how it shows up. What I have found, and I did gender-based work for many years back in the 90s, I found that if you address gender just through the gender lens, you get limited traction. You have to change the whole underlying power structure. So if you just look at sexual abuse and you don't look at the economics around it, you don't look at where the power is at the top of that supply chain, you really don't get at that problem in an isolated way, because it's part of a larger oppressive structure that involves race, economics, migration, and everything else. And so we have become very invested in how do we address these things intersectionally, because we're not making progress addressing them.
There's a question about healthcare. Whether these workers receive healthcare, get treated for their injuries?
Some don't. Some go to emergency rooms and then, hide in the debt economy. Some don't because they're afraid of deportation if they get healthcare. We have had, we have anecdotal evidence of employers who will drop a worker off who's practically unconscious at an emergency room and drive off and leave them on the sidewalk.
But
yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, it tends to be when they are seeking care, it's at in a much more severe condition. So we did that study with folks in Texas that organize workers in the construction industry, where and I believe it's been a while that the finding basically showed that workers were seeking work were seeking healthcare, were in the hospital having much more severe conditions, showing sort of that delay. And in Chicago, actually, temp workers, I remember in conversations with, I think it was a previous research project specifically in Chicago, that, folks were essentially, there wasn't reporting, they wouldn't report the wage stuff because it's like, okay, we live with this. And, they weren't reporting the conditions, but when they would actually start, when the organizers would actually connect with the workers was when they were actually so severely injured that they needed healthcare. And so they were seeking, workers' comp or help with a debilitating injury. And, they were no longer able to work. So it was sort of a point at which they were kind of coming out and saying something because of the need.
But for the most part, it's exactly as Brittany describes. Unless there's no choice, people generally tend to avoid seeking healthcare at all because they feel there's so much risk or debt associated with it. And just to answer Randy's question, yeah, the reasons are multifaceted. It's something people call the fissured economy, right? The way the economy has been broken up into so many pieces, so there's no accountability for what happens to workers. The fact that the racial wealth gap, the international trade policies, all these feed into the vulnerability, the exploitation, the abuse that ultimately in its most extreme form leads to forced labor and trafficking, but people suffer the entire continuum, and we shouldn't separate it because it's part and parcel of the same systemic problem. So
we sometimes talk about it as a lawless environment. There might be laws, but if they're not being enforced, it's a very, lawless environment.
So Chris, just to answer you, I think that was an indirect way of also answering your question, Chris. Policymakers know this. In fact, I know I saw Charlotte, I don't know if she's still on, but NELP has done a lot of and as we have as well, a lot of reports on the lawless nature of low-wage workplaces, just a total breakdown of rule of law. This is not something policymakers are unaware of. It is an open secret. The reality is that departments of labor are severely underfunded. A lot of localities face preemption, and the economy is such that workers cannot afford to lose even 1 week of wages. So to report a violation and to have retaliation and then have to wait 2 years for your case to be resolved is simply not having a remedy at all, which is how it's set up now. But this is not something policymakers don't know in every locality. It is the norm. It's like we accept something that is unacceptable. And it is, to me, the canary in the coal mine in terms of how rule of law first broke down many years ago in low-wage workplaces. And now it's breaking down up until the kind of highest levels of society. Because what we do to people that are most marginalized eventually becomes almost like cancerous across the country.
Quickly, the last question. Have you all done any work around illegal massage parlors?
We have not.
Okay, so that's a,
We have not, but we do have for those people interested, we have relationships with people who work in both kind of related arenas and with sex workers. So if people want just to make contacts in other localities and create relationships with people who are expert in industries where women are, it's almost expected that it's a part and parcel of the service. We do know people, and we have been part of sort of the larger conversations on that.
perfect. Thank you both for this outstanding and disturbing conversation. The reason why IHTI hosted this is that this is the beginning of a new line of work that we're going to put a lot more focus on labor exploitation. I hope those of you who are on the call will stay committed to work with us as we address this within our own community. It's more than time that we begin to eradicating this human rights violation in our communities and the state. Tomorrow is United Nations World Against Trafficking Day. And at 3 o'clock this afternoon, IHTI is going to be a part of a global conversation around human trafficking, and it's going to serve as a launch for a new video that Ms. Neeson has produced to talk about what is human trafficking. Many of you may remember that it was this film that he was in several years ago that launched the myth that trafficked persons were snatched off the street by strangers wishing to do ill. And we now know beyond a shadow of a doubt that that is very much not the case with human trafficking. So we hope you'll join us at 3 o'clock for that. And then starting next Wednesday, we're gonna bring into our conversations around the way forward, we're shining a light on the intersection of labor and sexual exploitation on boys and trans youth. So in the meantime, please stay healthy and safe. We hope to see you this afternoon and again next Wednesday. But by all means, continue to find ways to make good trouble. Good afternoon.